Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Iowa City Public Library. This is one of our programs for what we call WOW, Weber on Wednesday. And if you don't know who Irving Weber is, which looking at this audience, I have a feeling you all probably do know who Irving Weber is, but just in case, let me give you just a little background on Irving Weber and why we have programs on Weber, why we have the Weber Day program in the month of May. May is National Preservation Month, and we use it to celebrate local history. And Irving Weber was instrumental in preserving Iowa City's history. He wrote more than 800 articles for the Iowa City Press Citizen. We have them all. You can check them out if you like. There are 8 books with different colored bindings on them. They're also available through the University of Iowa's website, and they're available through our library catalog, which links to the university's website. And I have a couple colleagues in here, and I have to say that we use Irving Weber's columns a lot. He was, did a marvelous job of being able to share the history of Iowa City. And I think tonight's program is going to be a lot like that because we have a person who is doing the presentation, Judy Nyren, who loves Iowa City history as well. Maybe not as broadly as Irving Weber. Her program tonight is on Lucas Farms, and I'm very excited that she's here. And sitting right behind her is Ann Mangano, who next week is going to do a program that I think you might hear a little bit about tonight, but I don't want to spoil it for you. There are programs in the back that you can take with you that have that final program for Weber Days. And I do have one request for you. This is live on the library channel, and then we will turn it into a program that we'll put on our YouTube channel, and you can stream it through the website. So if, when you have something to ask or you have a reminiscence of Lucas Farms, please let me bring the microphone to you so we can capture that. Okay, Judy, thank you so much.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone, for coming out. I have lived in Iowa City 42 years, came with my husband, Dave, when he got a job here as a veterinarian, and I taught at Maeve's old hometown for a few years, but always have had an interest in history. And just very briefly, that's partly because when I was at Iowa State, that other college, I majored in what was then called home ec education, and then I minored in art. And for my requirements in home ec, I would always take these kind of odd courses like history of architecture, history of ornament, history of costume, and I had a wonderful professor who was actually a good friend of Margaret Keyes, and not knowing I'd end up here someday and actually be a longtime volunteer down at the Old Capitol Museum under Dr. Margaret Keyes. But it was kind of through that visual part of looking at history that it clicked for me. And so I became interested, especially in house architecture. So when we moved to Iowa City, we lived in upstairs of an older house for a while. And then when we started looking at houses, for better or worse, this little Moffett house kind of drew me in, and it was close to where my husband was working. So we've been in the same Moffett house for 42 years. But I'm very appreciative of that because we've really appreciated even more and more of the history of that. And I'll get to the Moffett houses in the second part of my presentation, and I'm more than willing to stay behind for as many questions as you might have. I will just mention all of these materials here are kind of supplemental if you want to look at those afterwards. I'm doing a lot of neighborhood research, and even though I know quite a bit about Iowa City history, a few years ago I decided to focus just on Lucas Farms. Because one of the things that's really unique to Lucas Farms, it started out as a farm. Governor Robert Lucas, the first territorial governor of the state of Iowa, purchased it for, I've seen quotes of both $150 to $200, 80 acres, that then the Lucas family expanded to 360 acres. And then in the early 1900s, in 1909, in fact, the family, his descendants, started selling it off. And it sold in little bits and pieces here and there over decades. So we believe we may have buildings from almost every decade in Iowa City's history. So then that gives us a chance not only to look at the architecture, which varies widely, as some of you residents would agree. We have little garages made into little houses next to Victorian houses and 60s, mid-century ranches, a little bit of everything. So let me just point out a couple of things on this side of the room. This is our new logo. I'm unveiling it in public. We've worked through the neighborhood services. Marcia Bollinger has been so helpful. And we had a local artist Ben Farrar designed this, and this is going to be popping up around the borders of our neighborhood to help people who come through identify even better and how we identify with the Governor Lucas home, Plum Grove. Now, the actual neighborhood, it's not supposed to resemble Montana, but for some reason this simplified map reminds me of that. So if you think here on the south, we have Highway 6, and this would be the location of the old former Kmart, and over here would be the location of Sycamore Mall, now Iowa City Marketplace, and this is Kirkwood Avenue, which has gone through 3 name changes. It was originally named Wyoming Road, then it was named Sumner Avenue. Some people say that was named after Friendly's son, but Sumner was her maiden name. And then it was named after Kirkwood Avenue, after Governor Kirkwood. Governor Kirkwood's home sits about right here. The Lucas home sits about right here in relationship to the neighborhood. There's over 700 households in our neighborhood, so there's lots of stories to tell. And about 2/3 of the neighborhood is on the original farmland. Your house would sit on the original farmland of Governor Lucas. And then we have these other 2, kind of have focused on the stories of these 2 farms, but other people would have owned that land, obviously. One of them is the Regan Tree Farm, which was active after the turn of the century into the early 30s, 40s. And that is why the streets there are named Pine, Spruce, Ash, and Sycamore. And I have been able to find online old receipts with the Regan Nursery headline on them. But there were 2 Regan family members that had nurseries here in Iowa City. One was north of City Park, around where the Elks took over some of that land. And then this was Charles Regan. And so it was just the typical kind of nursery, but they sold Christmas trees there. And that farmhouse still exists. I don't have a photo of that tonight. But anyway, so that's part of our heritage. There's a couple of other farms, like I said, the Hankeys, the Laffeters, that would have been well known to some people. And then a very prominent early Iowa Citian, Hugh Dinwiddie Downey, was Iowa City's first lawyer, first realtor. He was a banker. He owned a lot of land in Cedar, Johnson, and Iowa County, and the town of Downey is named after him. He helped establish that and thought it was going to grow more with the railroad. But anyway, Hugh Dinwiddie Downey owned that land back at the time of the Lucases, and Downey Drive is named after him. If you go back behind Mark Twain School, there's a street that one of our most esteemed residents lived on, and we'll get to that later. But anyway, if you think of that, behind Mark Twain School down to about Highway 6, that was where that was at. And you maybe heard of Cyrus Sanders mentioned once in a while. Well, Cyrus was not a resident, but his land came right up next to Governor Lucas's land, and he had a son named Euclid. And as far as we can tell, that's who that little block-long Euclid Street is named after, because Euclid Sanders was a contemporary of Governor Lucas's son, Edward, as well as Governor Kirkwood. They were all friends, and they helped start the first State Historic Society and some of those things. So there are a lot of connections there. So anyway, I think that's enough on that. And we'll kind of get started scrolling through some things. Okay, let's go back. So at the heart of our whole neighborhood is Governor Lucas's home, and it's called Plum Grove. He and his second wife, Friendly, lived there. They built it in the 1840s. They occupied it in 1844, and it's a Georgian revival home. It's open during summer hours, so take advantage. If you haven't ever been there, be sure to stop by this summer. And Governor Lucas built it for Friendly, his wife, to kind of remind her of Friendly Grove that she left behind in Ohio. It was quite an undertaking. Governor Lucas was probably more excited to come to Iowa than Friendly. She did not come at first. He came with 2 of his daughters, and they rode riverboat much of the way down the Ohio, I guess it would be, the Illinois possibly. They landed at Muscatine and rode horseback to Iowa City the first time that they visited. And so anyway, the Plum Grove name, I have read historic accounts of from between 200 and 400 plum trees were planted there. And she loved to cook, loved to garden and cook. So that's part of the heritage that is remembered, especially now through Johnson County Master Gardeners. They plant, and the historic foodies of Iowa City prepare authentic food just to remember that different time, different era. But we're very fortunate to have that. And as I said, about 2/3 of the neighborhood sits on his original farm. This is our other more prominent citizen, Governor Samuel Kirkwood. He was Iowa's Civil War governor. He served 2 terms as governor. He also served as a state senator in Washington, D.C., and he served as the Secretary of Interior under Garfield. Served for a very short time, obviously, under Garfield. But he's best known for his leadership preparing troops for the Civil War. Abraham Lincoln called upon him to get troops mustered. Iowa was a little over 20 years old as a state at that time, and there was only a militia. And it was quite a dilemma with funding and preparing the troops. So Governor Kirkwood actually used some of his own money, financed the equipment that the soldiers needed. And that really indicated his character. Governor Kirkwood was highly, highly respected. Now, Governor Kirkwood wasn't involved in politics all of his life. He had the mill in Coralville with Ezekiel Clark. And this is where I'll bring up all of the complicated family relationships. Governor Kirkwood's wife was the sister of sister-in-law to Robert Lucas's son, Robert, and they had all these names, Robert, Edward, they just kept repeating it. But they just lived down the street from them in what is now the location of the former Ardenia. But even Governor Lucas, his second wife, Friendly, was her brother married one of her daughters. So Governor Lucas's brother-in-law became his son-in-law. And you need a flow chart between the Lucases, the Kirkwoods, and the Clarks. And who am I leaving out? There were about 3 or 4 of those families that, how many people were there in Johnson County at that time? They were all marrying each other's brother and sister. It was quite interesting. But a lot of people miss this house. It sits back off of Kirkwood on the south side. And I might point out on that map, Governor Lucas's farm was Kirkwood and South. So if you lived on the other side of Kirkwood, you're not included in our neighborhood association. But there would have been a few more residents on the north side than on the south side of Kirkwood. So this is another well-known house, the Clark Bungee house it's referred to sometimes. And this was occupied by Jane Clark's sister, who was married to one of the Lucas boys. And it's been well restored and has been on the Friends of Historic Home tour before. One of Governor Lucas's other sons built a house in 1855, and then that was remodeled into Ardenia, and we'll see that here. This is all that's left of Ardenia. And Governor Lucas's son, who built the brick farmhouse that sat here, it was remodeled into an English castle in the 1920s by a man named Albert Berkeley, who owned a hotel downtown. He was described somewhat eccentric and flamboyant, and he built this incredible castle-like facade around the front of the original home and named it Ardenia after a castle in England. That stood there for quite a few years while we've lived in the neighborhood, and I do have videotape of that, and now the Johnson County Historic Society has that. They allowed us to go in and videotape it before it was demolished, and I'll admit that's a big regret that we weren't able to save that. We tried so hard back then to save that. So there's just a handful of other houses from the late 1870s to 80s in our neighborhood. But by the early 1900s, the Lucas family was ready to break up the farm. So this house was actually built, it's on Marcy Street, to be the headquarters for the realtors. And I think at first they maybe thought, oh, this is going to go great, it's going to sell off. But according to records, it didn't go so well. So then they hired a real estate company out of Cedar Rapids to help. And the very center section of our neighborhood developed fairly quickly. If you look at the houses on Marcy and Keokuk, you'll see some older houses. This is one that was built right about at that time, kind of a classic farm-style house. But this is our mystery house in our neighborhood. This house has not been occupied since 1958. and it was left just as it was, and it has an old Plymouth car in the garage and a Maytag washer on the back porch. And there were some unusual family events that went on, and so it's been put into trust. But someday we hope to be able to tell a little bit more about that story. So in that center section that was developed in the 1900s, and this confuses us a lot of times, we see houses in our neighborhood from different time periods, and I was starting to do some research on some of them, but then found that many of them were moved in. So the architecture is earlier, but they were moved in. So this is an example of a structure that was moved into our neighborhood, and that Carl and Amy live here, and that house was a grocery store on Madison Street in Iowa City, and his grandparents lived there for many years. And this house has a small vineyard, what the remains of a vineyard, and his parents were wonderful gardeners and had this wonderful vineyard that they used to make the wine for Zion Lutheran Church for many years. And Carl said, you know, everyone raved about the wine, so no one missed communion. And now Carl, the descendant, so it's been in 3 generations. And that's on Florence Street, which is named after one of Governor Lucas's granddaughters. This is an example of a house on Keokuk, this wonderful craftsman, and this house kind of represents probably some of the property that was sold, and then that was the era of the house. Quite a few craftsmen in the Longfellow area, but not so many in our neighborhood particularly, but that's a beautiful example of a craftsman with a Dutch colonial roof. So before I get into the Moffats, a couple of things I'll go back to mention. When I mentioned about houses being moved in, we're learning this more all the time, and we just keep digging. I keep digging. And so one of the houses, there's another 4-square farmhouse similar to that one that I told you, that's kind of our mystery house, that sits on the south end of our neighborhood down at the end of Broadway Street. And this would confuse me because we knew that the lots were broken up in 1900, or about 1909, and then Howard Moffett came in the 1930s for the most part, the late 20s to 30s, and started building. And then nothing developed until the 50s or 60s when the whole neighborhood practically became enveloped. But these houses that were moved in, there was an era there, probably in the late 50s, early 60s, when the university was expanding, and our friend Max Yoakum was at work all around Iowa City. And for those of you who don't know, Max Yoakum would be as well known as Howard Moffett in some circles. And over the years when I've talked about Moffett, sometimes people mix the two up. But Howard Moffett was more on the creative, innovative side, whereas Max Yoakum was more on the rebel, innovative side of things. And there is a house that sits at the end of Broadway Street that I found an article in the Daily Iowan Archives, and it shows Max Yoakum in front of this big 4-square farmhouse, and he had parked it overnight in a downtown Iowa City parking lot and plugged the meter because he ran out of daylight to finish moving it to the lot. And that was the kind of thing he'd do. He blocked roads overnight, he ran into bridges, and just you name it, he stretched, you know, the rule of law and the house moving business as far as he could. And then he would frustrate the city council so much, he finally decided to run, and he made it onto the city council. So that would have been interesting to watch. So if you do drive through our neighborhood and you see this odd patchwork of different years of houses, it's because some of them maybe were bought up and a little farmstead was there. We do know of another 4-square on Marcy Street that Betty Sedlacek, her whole family goes back there, and there was a dairy barn there, and there's that kind of odd texture to our neighborhood. So the Moffats, though, are one of our treasures, and Moffett built houses on the east side of Iowa City for the most part. He built a few in Coralville and a couple on Riverside Drive. There's only one left. And I tell a little story about Howard Moffett because he was quite an innovator. He loved to try businesses and probably had a desire to get ahead. And he came close to going bankrupt. I'm not sure if he actually ever filed for bankruptcy, but he had some pretty hard years. He lost his Triangle Auto Supply, and we have found old ads for that now as well. But not too far from here, I think just this next block behind us is where Triangle Auto Supply was in the ground floor. And then up above, he had an indoor golf course. That lasted maybe about a year, but the Daily Iowan had these grandiose, almost full-page ads describing that indoor golf course. And of course, you know, this was probably about the time of the Great Depression, and he wasn't afraid to try different things. So there was that part of Howard Moffett, and he did go to law school. He was probably quite intelligent and very creative, and he had a partner, Blakesley, I can't think of Mr. Blakesley's, Robert Blakesley, I believe, who helped him, and then his wife would help design the houses along with her friend who was an artist, and they would kind of take on a characteristic of an English cottage, or they would look at Better Homes and Gardens and get ideas. So let's look at some of the actual characteristics of the Moffetts, and here's where I'd like to just tell a little bit of story. I've said that it reminds me of the Aesop's fable, Who Will Bell the Cat, if you've ever heard that. And that story goes that there was a house that became overrun with mice, and so the owner got a cat, and this became quite a tragedy for the mice because the cat was quite efficient at catching the mice. And so the mice had a meeting and said, what are we going to do about this cat? And they were all brainstorming and figuring out, what can we do about the cat? And one of the oldest mice said, I have an idea. We need to put a bell on the cat so we can hear the cat coming, and then we can get to safety. Everybody applauds the old wise cat and think, what a wonderful idea. But the very littlest, youngest cat said, or mouse said, but who will bell the cat? And that just shows that sometimes there's a problem and you can have a solution, but someone has to have the courage to do something or go against the flow and try something different. So Iowa City had a terrible housing crisis in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. It was exacerbated in the 40s after all the veterans, GIs, came back. But I just got to read a new item about Moffett. We got into the file at the State Historic Society. And there's a quote there from Robert Blakesley, and it's written in kind of just the language of the time, and it said, when they were building these houses, started building houses out of recycled materials, so it was cheap, said we couldn't even get the kitchen curtains hung, and kitchen was spelled K-I-T-C-E-N, and curtains was spelled K-I-R-T-I-N-S, kitchen curtains. They wouldn't even get them hung, and they'd have the place sold. And they realized that, hey, there's this problem, there's not enough housing, especially for grad students or post-grad students, medical students, law students, et cetera, who might have a family and need to be in a house. So the two of them started deliberately building these houses to rent instead of to sell. So when they started building them to rent, they could get by with the fact that maybe not all the doors matched or the doorknobs matched, and maybe there was a funny window there that didn't really even work, but it was just for decoration. You know, people were renting them, so they weren't having to sell them. Obviously, Moffett houses would not pass any kind of a building code requirement in this day and age, but there was a real need for them. So Howard Moffett really helped solve a problem. So some of the characteristics of Moffett homes: they look like elves live in them. No, they don't, but they are usually of modest proportions. Some have been altered to have more space. They often have a prominent fireplace, particularly on the front side of the house. They have unusual gables and roof lines. They might have an irregular or informal placement of windows and doors. And they often have European or even American influence in their design. And that American influence, some of them look a little bit craftsman, but others look a little cottage-ish. And the other thing to keep in mind is that everyone always says, oh yes, those little Moffetts over on Lower Muscatine, or on Muscatine, excuse me. Those are the ones that are on the National Historic Register, and the stone ones are the ones that are the most quaint and unique, but most of his houses were wood frame houses. He would build them out of whatever. He built using bricks from when City High was torn down, and I suspect that our floors might be from one of the old school buildings. We've had them covered up for a while, but okay, another thing, they have underground or attached garages, and this was pretty innovative at the time of construction, the 1920s and 40s. If you think of most craftsman houses, they had detached garages, you know, it'd be tucked back at the end of the driveway. Well, Moffett, we've now learned, he had a team of horses and a wagon. This was a low-cost operation. He would back the wagon up into the lot. He would dig out the garage area first and load the dirt into the wagon to be hauled away. And then when that little garage area was dug out, he would back his wagon in, and then they would finish digging out the basement. It kind of saved on labor and time. So he made these little ramps, and then he turned them into garages. So if you drive around, you'll see quite a few of them have that odd little garage, and it was really probably designed more for labor saving. So that was pretty innovative. There weren't attached garages. It was unusual. Obviously, the materials he used were mixed. He was famous for recycling, and we'll see that when I show you a bunch of pictures of Moffett houses. And there's a number of different exterior finishes, but also what a wide range of creativity. And even though Moffett liked to save money, and it said that was where Blakesley differed from Moffett, sometimes he didn't want to just save money. Moffett did not like to spend money, but Moffett was more than willing to spend money on labor because it took a lot more time to make these complicated little houses with stair steps and uneven levels and things. But he would come downtown Iowa City during the Depression and recruit day laborers, even at the bars and things like that. So sometimes you can tell when someone didn't have a lot of skill working on a Moffett. And we think we have like 13 levels, but some of those have been added in our home. Nancy and Sally, how many levels are in your Moffett?
Sure, it's down to the living room, down to the dining room. And, upstairs, it's down to the bedroom. So, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and then down to the garage, right.
Yeah, there's like 3 steps down to the garage.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very typical. And like mushrooms, even though they might look like little elves' mushroom houses, if you find one, you usually find several. Because Howard Moffett went to areas that were cheap land. So at the time he was building in Longfellow neighborhood, that was a pretty serious floodplain there. And that land was fairly cheap. And it was close to the edge of the city limits. Same thing with our neighborhood, Lucas Farms. Ewell Street was the very edge of the city limits, and for many years, until the 1960s, most of the streets in our neighborhood were not paved. It wasn't until the mid-century ranches came in, they paved, and then they filled in the rest of those gravel streets. Well, this was Howard Moffett's home. And we've had the privilege of talking to Howard Moffett's son in the last year. Howard Moffett got married a little bit later in life, so he had his 2 children when he was a little older, and his son still lives in South Texas. He's 88 years old, and he comes up to Iowa every year. We're trying to get him to come here to Iowa City. I don't think he understands this kind of cult following he has for his dad's houses, but this was a building that existed before. Mary Ellen Buchanan, who's a longtime resident of Johnson County, and she's supposedly the last living descendant of the Lucas family. Her parents lived in this when they were first married in the 1920s. And then Howard Moffett moved in like in the 30s. But he remodeled it, and then John Dyson and his wife have lived here for many years, and they've done a great job of, it's an extensive remodel, but everything's been done within the character of the original house. So it is a beautiful, beautiful home. And that sits on Kirkwood Avenue and Marcy. So this is one of Moffett's home that looks more like a French cottage. And on the interior, this couple that lives here now, nothing has been changed. The cupboards and everything are original. So this is quite unique because we've said if you live in a Moffett, you can't live in a museum. You know, they were built for a different era, and you do sometimes have to make some improvements and changes, but that's such a pretty little house with that unique roof. So another thing that Moffett did was he built gables and just all kinds of little additions. This sits right next, well, 2 houses down from yours, Joan. But a couple of years ago, when we were trying to identify the Moffats in our neighborhood and help people understand how different each one was, we started naming them so that there'd be something about the architecture that would stand out. So we call this one Tall Gable Moffat. And look how tall steep that gable is, and that fireplace. That has a very steep roof line. And this is Small Gable Moffat. You see that little tiny gable right there? And this sits close to Mark Twain School. Now, you'll notice this one has stone. So a year ago at this time, Jeff Shabelian and Ray Anderson, I believe his name is, 2 retired university professors, and Jeff had been real involved with historic preservation for years. They went around the neighborhood with me, and they were able to identify where some of these stones came from, because we know that Howard Moffat wasn't going out and buying stones from King's Material in Coralville. And they found that some were from Stone City, some were from a quarry that was kind of where the Mayflower sits right now. Some of them were from that little quarry that sat over by the art building that's part of that. And some of them were just river rock and field kind of rocks and debris. So here's another Moffat. Kind of has a flat flagstone. When you start looking at the stones, then you realize almost every house, even if it's built with stone, is individual. This sits on Cottonwood, and that's another Moffat right behind it. By the way, there's a little library, and we have 17 of those in our neighborhood. It's a good thing. And this one is kind of a cabin in the woods Moffat. Call it Cabin in the Woods. And that has just river rock boulders in the fireplace. This one sits on the corner of Ewell and Highland. And this is kind of unique with that kind of gambrel roof. There's not really, I haven't seen another Moffat that has quite that shape to it, but that looks very English to me.
That doesn't have many windows.
Yeah. Well, our house is pretty dark. A lot of the Moffats don't have really good light. So this is another little Moffat, and this was Glenn Epstein's home. If you know Glenn Epstein, the calligrapher, kind of an Iowa City icon, he lived there, and he was so thrilled to be able to live in a Moffat those last few years. And this is a quaint little one, and we've been keeping track of our veterans as well too. I'm going to say it wrong, Fleischman lived there, and he had lost a leg in World War II. And so we've been learning a little more history about residents and stories by looking at veteran stories as well. But here's a picture inside that little Moffat on Ewell Street. And any guesses? Look at this little mantelpiece there. Anyone have any idea of how Moffat might have made that mantelpiece? Don't be afraid to say it. Anything's possible with Howard Moffat. It's an eaves trough. It's a metal rain eaves trough with a piece of scrap wood on the top. So Moffat would use like chair railings for gingerbread on the exterior. He used this odd sawdust for insulation that he actually treated with something. My husband's told this story before about how we had our home inspected when we bought it. We had some concerns. We kept seeing some wood that had charring on it, and we wanted our fireplace inspected. And so the fire department came out, and they couldn't find any record of our house ever having a fire. Well, years later, as we researched Moffat more, we found out he was salvaging some university buildings, particularly that burned. So we have these big wood, oversized beams in our house, and they were probably recycled from some kind of a salvage thing. This one we call Blue Bottle Moffat, and that's what this bottle is here to remind me of. So the person that lives here, the couple, he happens to be an architectural historian, actually, and a couple of years ago they had the exterior completely renovated and had a historical input on the house colors. But look at that chimney. See, that's classic. You get that oversized chimney, and it's a little bit like recognizing folk artists. You know, they have a certain style. I've said that Howard Moffett was like a folk architect. He just kind of did it his own way, and yet once you really know, you can start going down a street and say, oh, that's got to be a Moffett. Oh, that looks like a Moffett. You know, sometimes they do get vinyl siding and things that do change some of the original architecture, but you can still usually tell by the placement of windows and fireplaces. This is on Ewell Street, and we call this Blue Bottle Moffett partly because of the shape of the fireplace, but homeowners have agreed to these names, by the way, and they found over 100 bottles, antique bottles, in their backyard. And supposedly Howard Moffett would go out to the city dump and just get anything he could, and he must have used it for fill dirt because the back side of their house slopes steeply down into a ravine in what we call Moffett Hollow. And there's no real explanation. They're all from the right time period of when the house would have been built. But they found them when they were starting to dig up for a garden and expecting to find, you know, soil, and found all these old bottles. This is a quaint little Moffett house that sits on Friendly Avenue, named after Governor Lucas's wife, Friendly. And this was Paul Ingalls' first home here in Iowa City. And I had read that he had built in the backyard some kind of a little cottage, a getaway, because his daughters were fairly young at that time. So he had a little writing building in the backyard. And this house has a rounded dining room on the right side there, you can see it. And it said that Howard Moffett, when he would build these round, once in a while he'll build a round room, and he would just take like a willow branch and stretch it out and mark it, and okay, that's the circumference of the round room. We also like to say that Howard probably didn't own a T-square or a level, and so if you've ever been in a Moffett, they're a little uneven and unlevel. Paul Ingalls' family, actually during the time they were living here, this is just kind of an interesting footnote, they had a summer home they rented up around Stone City, and his wife and daughters had gone ahead of him up there one summer in the 50s, and 2 men had escaped from the Anamosa prison and landed right there at this house they were renting and held his wife and daughter captive, and Paul Ingalls came upon the scene not knowing what had happened. So they were held a number of hours, but thankfully the 2 prisoners were not from the, you know, weren't the brightest couple of criminals, and the Ingalls weren't harmed. But at the same time, that had to be quite a dramatic set of circumstances there. And then right across the street is what we call Fossil Rock Moffett, and this is just one of exceptional Moffetts. It has 2 fireplaces, and very reminiscent of a English cottage. And so I'm going to show a close-up of that. So Howard Moffett could have just slapped up a bunch of rocks, but what does he do? But on the front of the building are all these unique fossils. So if you go up close to it, they're not just stones, but they're ones with very unique fossil characteristics. So there's a tree limb branch that would have been growing out of that at some time. And that's where it was so helpful when Jeff Shabilian and Ray came through the neighborhood and were able to identify some of these things. There's some sea life fossilized. So then this house is on Ewell Street, and we call it DeGowan Moffett number 1. So Dr. Richard DeGowan, a few years ago, wrote a book called House of Moffett, and I always recommend this to everyone. It's not necessarily just about Moffett. Some people would like to see a book more about Moffett himself, but this is about growing up in the era of the 40s, early 50s in Iowa City and living in a Moffett house. So we've gotten to meet Dr. DeGowan on a number of occasions.
That's the book that is also very, very political.
It is, but it's his personal memoir. It's how he remembers things.
He keeps wishing that he would write more about the houses and keep
Yeah.
politics out of it.
Yeah, and it's just his personal perspective and memory. But that people would like to hear something more about Howard Moffett himself. But anyway, his parents rented this house from Howard in the late 30s, early 40s. And Dr. DeGowan said his parents just loved Howard Moffett. So this is a really good resource to know a little bit more about Howard Moffat's character. He was a great landlord. As a matter of fact, stories told that on Easter Sunday, he was in his dress suit and someone in the neighborhood needed a new toilet seat. Their toilet seat broke. And so he was carrying a toilet seat down the street to repair that. But then on the other side of that, Howard one time tried to use old wooden toilet seats that probably were discarded from the university or something. They were oak. He tried to use those instead of lath to plaster a wall in a Moffat. And the wall pretty much collapsed on itself. So some of his ideas worked and some didn't. And the DeGowans were so pleased with their Moffat that, well, this is another Moffat that sits on what's called Moffat Hollow. That's a really pretty house as well.
Is that some of these are very large, look as though they've been added on.
Yeah, I remember when that one was added on too.
I think that,
But inside they have a very cozy feel.
just the garage was added to that.
Yeah, yeah. The kitchen, the garage, the old garage was turned into the kitchen. So this was Dr. DeGowan's parents, Dr. Elmer DeGowan, who's the renowned University of Iowa researcher who refined the blood transfusion process. And this is the house they bought from Howard Moffat. And again, this sits on Friendly Avenue on what we call Moffat Hollow. Now, then by having this wonderful book by Dr. DeGowan that told some of these stories, he explained that at the end of World War II, his dad obviously had been so involved in getting that blood transfusion refined just before the outbreak of World War II. So he's spending a lot of time communicating with doctors in Europe, in England. And then he and his wife, she was very involved in the League of Women Voters and relief work. And they did a lot of relief work for London during the Blitz. So one of Winston Churchill's personal doctors came here to Iowa City to thank them for everything they had done at the end of the war and had dinner in that quaint little Moffat. Here's another cute little one, and look at the sway of that roof. And that's intentional. It's a kind of an Irish cottage house, almost like if it were a thatched roof. It kind of imitates a thatched roof. And there was a cadet from the University of Iowa. They had the Naval Flight School here, which was a very important part of Iowa City's history during World War II. And there's photographs of him, one of the officers, standing in front of that house. And this is Sally and Nancy's house, their little Cotswold cottage on Pickard Street. Pickard's named after one of the University of Iowa presidents. As a matter of fact, most of the streets in our houses, in our neighborhood, have a story as well. There's history just even in the names of the streets. So this sits at the corner of Friendly and Pickard. And it is a delightful house. Now, this was built by one of Howard Moffat's contractors. He worked for Moffat, so it's very Moffat-esque, but it was not built by Moffat, and it does have a lot more refinement, you might say. And around the front door, those are all geodes, Iowa State's rock. Those are all geodes, and the fireplace inside is covered in geodes as well. So we call that the geode house. And this is my house. Obviously, it was taken at Halloween time. So you can see ours is one of those where Moffat would have dug out that driveway and part of the basement, backed that wagon in to load the dirt and gravel, and then cleaned out the rest of the basement. We've had remodeling work on ours as well. But then, I don't know if you're familiar with a cat slide. We have a little bit of a modified cat slide. Notice how our roof line has that curve to it, and that's just enough to kind of distinguish it. But that's an English architectural term that you can just imagine a cat getting up there on the roof and then sliding down. A small child. And then we have the steep fireplace. Dave, is there anything you'd mention about our Moffat?
It's weird.
It's weird.
Well, there's concrete walls.
She's going to get a mic to you. Yeah, the walls are made of concrete.
Well, like Judy said, every door is different.
It's going to the electron.
There's no two doors that are alike. And laundry chute, Judy?
in the garage that just goes kind of to nowhere. Joan has a window on the front of her house that you can't get to that little closet
One of the
either.
bedroom walls are literally concrete, and when I tried to put screws or nails in, and it wasn't easy.
Yeah, it wasn't plaster, it's concrete.
And then, as Judy mentioned earlier, there was charred wood in the attic, charred wood in the basement. But, because he recycled, she mentioned university buildings, but even farm buildings and things that burn, he'd recycle and he'd get it free. You know, was able to build from that. So, other than just all the different levels.
I've got a flour sack that we found under the floorboards, and we also had a newspaper that was put there at some time when it was remodeled in the 60s, a small remodel, and it was of John Hughes and his wife. And John Hughes is the one who we sat in his office, and he gave us the loan when we bought our house. So that was kind of an irony. John and Karen Hughes. He was the former Hills Bank president. But anyway, in terms of the Moffats, you know, it's important to try to save what we can, and if someone had the energy, there's probably more that deserve to be on the National Historic Register. A few years back, there was a professor here from MIT on like a summer sabbatical or something, and a friend arranged for me to walk her around the neighborhood, and she explained that there's really only two other places in the entire country where there's Moffat houses. And one of those was in Michigan. They're not Moffats, but they were this kind of recycled material kind of build. You'll find cottages and houses that look similar, but the thing that distinguished Moffat was that he did almost everything from salvage materials.
Including railroad ties, we don't mention railroad.
Oh yes, he used railroad ties.
And attics.
Right, yep.
Actually, I think there are trolley tracks that they tore up from Iowa City.
From Rundell is what I've heard.
There used to be a trolley that ran through there, and they tore up the tracks. We have them in our basement. And the rest of it is walnut,
Okay.
big wide beams of walnut, real thick.
That's what I think's in our attic too. Yeah. Well, that's the last slide. We might bring up the lights, and I'll just mention a couple more things about Lucas Farms neighborhood. So the Moffats are probably one of the attractions, but there's so much more. One of those would be the people. And I was telling, we have at least 9 residents that have their own Wikipedia pages. And so some of our residents, obviously Governor Kirkwood and Governor Lucas and Paul Engel, also Bill Sachter, and we have some poets and authors. Dave Morris, who wrote the Rambo series, he lived in our house, or our neighborhood. And I've got a couple of pictures here of the Lucases as well as the Kirkwoods, if you wanted to look at that, Samuel and Jane. And I really like studying their family history because they had such hard times. And just last Friday night, we had our first Lyrics of Lucas Farms poetry night, and that was organized by some other people in the neighborhood. But Governor Lucas was known for writing poems in his retirement. And he had actually quite a bit of hardship in his life. A lot of people joke and say, oh, he was such a crotchety old man. And he no doubt was a pretty serious guy. He was a Quaker, and he was really a devout person and took life kind of seriously. His dad was a Revolutionary War veteran, and then Governor Lucas was a veteran of the War of 1812 and had a military background. So when he came here to Iowa, he had a job to do. He was kind of a task-oriented kind of individual. And a lot of the early pioneers and settlers and legislators, they kind of like to do their work and then have a little gambling on the side, a little drinking on the side. And so that created a little bit of a disconnect. And he didn't really have a lot of people that rallied behind him. Governor Kirkwood, his statue stands in the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. in Statuary Hall. And he served his country well and was such a good model for the soldiers. And Jane knitted socks for the soldiers. And they called her Mother Kirkwood. And Camp Pope was about due north of where the Kirkwood home sits. So if you think about going across the tracks to Longfellow School, the Kirkwood home was completed in 1864, just year out before the war ended. But right across from that to the north was Camp Pope, where the soldiers were mustered in. And many of them came to Iowa City from rural areas and they'd never seen a train. And the train was just completed here. The train whistle, they'd come running down to the tracks. It was so exciting. But then that was also where they departed for the war front. They would get into boxcars and go from Iowa City to the Quad City area, where then they'd be, some of them sitting down river, some across to the east. But those are very significant stories. And the books and things I have here kind of highlight how many people we have. As I said, we have at least 9 people that have their own Wikipedia pages. And the last one's probably Tim Dwight. So he grew up in our neighborhood, the football player. Now, we have Ewell Street named after George Ewell, but he never actually lived in our neighborhood. But we take advantage of that Ewell Street moniker, and he was really kind of Iowa City's first artist. He drew a lot of the images of Iowa City before there was photography and painted early pictures of Old Capitol. And the portrait of Lucas that hangs in Plum Grove was done by George Ewell. He drew a couple of cartoons that got him the attention of some prominent Iowans who said, this kid's talented. And George Ewell had come to Iowa City with his mother. She was a widower, and he was growing up here in Iowa City, and then some of these prominent Iowans said, we need to send this boy to art school. So that kind of started his career, but we have some information about Ewell here. I also have a sample. I don't bring my actual palimpsest anymore because these are like gold, but this is an incredible article about Moffat houses from the State Historic Society publication. And there's a book about Ardenia here that you can look at, and then this Lucas Farms history has some of these prominent citizens, and some of it's just interesting stories. So I'll just finish on one last story because we say we're a modest neighborhood with a rich history. We were the home of the last mule-driven wagon in Iowa City, and that mule actually got hit by a train in the area of Kirkwood Avenue and probably what would be Maiden Lane. And the mule had to be put down and the driver died. But just think back, this was in the 50s, there were still mules and livestock there in our neighborhood, so it really helps you understand what a odd, unique neighborhood we have. So,
Can you say something about one other street
yes.
in your neighborhood to get people excited about next week's program?
Oh, yes. Well, Ginter Avenue, I live on Ginter, and years ago when we first moved in, my son is a history buff. We always thought he'd be the next Irving Weber. He loved his Irving Weber books, and we learned that our street was named after one of the Lucas family's racehorses that became quite famous, Larry Ginter. So from the Iowa City Library, Ann will be presenting a program a week from tonight in the same room on Larry Ginter. She has dug up so much information, even has a little film of Larry Ginter.
Not a film, that's just, that was just actually that was set in Hartford, Connecticut. But I do have pictures.
Okay.
So he was in a stock breeding book that went national. He was quite the horse.
Yeah.
He was not a good sire, though. None of his descendants did very well, but the Press Citizen called him an Iowa City streak of lightning in the shape of a horse. And he was a Lucas family horse.
I've got her article up here if you wanted to look at that closer. Over here is her article, and you can get a little taste of what you might hear next week. And I'm willing to stay and answer questions. I know the meaning of most of the streets, and there's a lot of other stories to tell, but...
Well, I was lucky enough to be a guide for the Friends of Historic Preservation several years ago when the houses were on tour, and if they ever are open again, you should go because, oh my goodness, looking at them from the outside is one thing, but being able to go inside is a whole nother experience. In fact, one time I looked at a Moffat house and the people who were helping me said, you know how expensive this is going to be to get it up to code because there were lots of slopes and the wiring had some issues. I don't think the house had been out of the original or the second person's possession until the time it went for sale, and it was so enticing, but it was going to be an expensive
Money pit.
endeavor. But oh, they are wonderful homes. And one last thing before I let other people talk is, I've done a little bit of research on Max Yoakum, and my favorite story about Max is one time when he was moving houses and he got stuck somewhere, he hadn't renewed his license plates for like 3 years. He just didn't follow the same rules that everybody
Right.
else did. And there's lots of fascinating research on Max Joachim. And we have a lot of resources here at the library. We have the palimpsest that you can look at still in print if you like. It's also online. And then we have newspaper archives, so you can delve back into the history of Iowa City. And if you come next week, Ann can tell you where she did all of her research. But anyone else like to tell the story of their house?
Or any questions?
Oh, hang on.
I got a quick
Wait,
question.
hang on quick. Just a second.
This won't take very long.
That's okay.
I was at City High in the 1950s, and we had a coach named Howard Moffett.
Oh, yes, okay. And
What?
it's spelled exactly the same, and it's difficult when you're doing research. You really have to know what articles pop up. Howard Moffett worked at the university in the athletic department, and they were both spelled the same, but there was an age difference, too.
No relation.
Not that I know of. No.
I didn't know that. That's fascinating.
They have different middle names, so often you'll see Howard Moffat's name. I want to say Howard Francis Moffett, I think is his full name, and this other Moffett had a different middle name, but it gets confusing when you look at the archives. I use the Daily Iowan Archives for a lot of information. For instance, that's how I learned the first bicycle license distributed in Iowa City was on Ginter Avenue. And this young man went on to be injured in the Pacific Theater of World War II, was featured in Life magazine, and these are the kind of stories that we're still pulling up, but yeah.
And Jeff Shabilian did a program for Weber Days, probably 5 or 6 years ago on the stone cottages of Iowa City. And not all of them are Moffett houses, but many of them are, and that's on our live stream at the library. So if you'd like to see that, I can give you the address to find that. Oh, you do have something.
I heard a story about some other family that opened up a wall in their Moffett, and a whole lot of rubber raincoats were in the wall as insulation. It wasn't us, but our house was described as a shabby rental when Jim and Hurd and Pat Lohman moved across the street. And it was rented by people in the writer's workshop
Okay.
and carved up into little sections. Like there was a curtain across the dining room, and somebody slept behind the curtain.
Okay.
We've had people stop and,
Lots.
yeah,
That
a
are bad
lot of
to
people
look
have
for.
stopped, and we tend to invite them in and let them see what it looks like now. But there are stories of,
There were a number of houses in our neighborhood evidently that were rented to Iowa workshop writers that were here for a short while.
Well, they said they had an underground press in the garage.
Oh.
and I know they had some wild parties that involved alcohol because our hearth, our original hearth was all chopped up
With an axe.
with people chopping wood on the hearth, I think. Which
Wow.
has since been replaced. But, yeah.
Well, our house did not have much of an exotic past, but I do know from former older newspaper archives that Norman Sage, Professor Norman Sage, who was at the university in the journalism and English department, he and his wife lived there when their children were younger, and she used to put puppet shows on in the driveway. So I found that in the Daily Iowan, but also Dr. DeGowan recalled those puppet shows that were there. And it's kind of ironic because most of my life I've worked with kids, and we used to show movies and do things in that quirky driveway and have races, you know, with Matchbox cars down it, and interesting. Yes?
I'm kind of new to this area, but where is this archival research and stuff that you use and she uses up here in the library, or is that the State Historical Library or the Johnson County Historical area, or what?
Well, obviously you can get some things from the State Historic Society, and I also work a lot with the Johnson County Historic Society now, especially since we have the building used to belong to the State Historic Society. It still does, but the Johnson County Historic Society manages it. Where I get a lot of my quirky information is from the Daily Iowan Archives, and they're free online. But it's very, very tedious.
You can get them through the University of Iowa, but we have a page on our library website, icpl.org, that has lots and lots of local history
Yes.
resources.
You have
On
that
it.
what do you call that page? Don't you have a link?
A genealogy page,
Not so much genealogy, isn't there?
it's called Local History.
Okay.
Local History, and it has many of the books. Most of them are in the same number. That DeGowan book is from our collection, that's 977.77765, which is Iowa City history. We have a very good, I think, collection of
Yes.
Iowa City history, and many things can be found online now, too.
Right.
So I can guide you to those things.
There's a lot of books. I have collected almost every book written about Iowa City over the years, so I use those. And not too much from the Johnson County Historic Society. They don't have a lot of information, so that's probably not a good starting point. But books are the best starting point.
I thought this would be a good time to say that the Iowa City Public Library is working with Advantage Companies to digitize early Iowa City newspapers up until 1924, so that should be coming in the next couple months.
And there are also two really good early histories of the Iowa City area. We have them in print, but they're also on Google Books. And one's called Leading Events of Johnson County, and the other one is called, is it The History of Johnson County? And they're just chock full. And these things, the resources that you're reading, like Irving Weber, sometimes there might be a little
Difference of opinion? on
license
what- yeah,
taken in the
right.
stories, but the ones from the Leading Events in Johnson County are the interviews with people and their remembrances of them. So that's how they remember it, and you can go way back in time and find out just the most amazing things. That's one of the funnest parts of our job, is when we get
Right.
questions about these kinds of history, where we can actually go back in time
Right.
and find them.
Yes, and there's a few survivors out there I've met and come across. Some, Ruth Hughes, her husband Dick Hughes, his parents were the last ones to own Plum Grove before it went over to the state, and he went on to become an educator and a principal here in Iowa City, and she contacted me. She lives at Oak Knoll, and so we've become friends, and she's told me different things that I didn't know. We also had the circus for years, was in our neighborhood, kind of on that flat level plain to the west edge, but such a different era, you know.
And if you go to our website, you can look at many of the other Weber programs we have done, because we've been lucky enough to record them and then be able to share them with anybody in the world. We have a couple of Irving Weber interviews, or Irving Weber guides. I just watched one on ferries and bridges in Iowa City, because we are writing, Ann and I and another coworker are writing a little history of not only the bridges of Iowa City, because the park bridge is new, but the ferries that were in Iowa City, and then there were steamboats, and so there's a whole world out there. So, and if you have ideas of other programs you'd like us to do, let us know. Judy has very graciously volunteered to do this, and I thank you so much. It was a wonderful program.
Thank you. I have one footnote. You might have wondered what the candle was. There's two little things there I meant to mention with the Lucases. And one is that it was said that Governor Lucas could see the fires of the Meskwaki across the river from his land there, which really takes you to another time. And sometime we do want to do more of the Native American history of our neighborhood. We have Keokuk Street, and so we can tell that whole story about Chief Keokuk. But Governor Lucas, especially in his older years, wrote these poems, and he also enjoyed Bible study. He was Quaker, became Methodist. And one day he had a bunch of his friends over, and this was like, instead of a poker party like the rest of the legislators, he was having a Bible study. And Friendly used to get a little annoyed with him having his friends over all the time. And one day he said, "Could you make us a light lunch?" And Friendly had evidently kind of had enough with his friends hanging around, so she brought a candlestick, stuck it on the table, lit it, and said, there's your light lunch. And so that candlelight kind of reminds us of Friendly, whom, like many wives, kind of has to put up maybe with a little something or other now and then. But anyway, thank you so much for inviting me.